Hello, everyone. I haven't posted on this channel for a little while. It's been a busy Christmas, but we're now in 2025, and I think I'm ready to start again. I had a look back at some of my posts on Twitter, and I realized that some of you don't really use Twitter, but there's some really great stuff that I picked up on over the last couple of years that I think I would like to share with you. I'm not going to share it all at once. I'm just going to share it in bits and pieces, but I hope this is going to be useful. We're going to stay on topic in education, though. So I talk a lot about education on this channel. Why do I do that? Because essentially, we all know children are the future, but here in Canada, they're generally educated in a public education system. And that means that that public education system is fundamental to the future of that functioning society. But unfortunately, our public education system has become rather bloated, expensive and inefficient, and completely politically radicalized. And that's happened because we've trusted our governments to do a good job. And whilst we've trusted them and haven't really looked under the hood, a lot of crazy things have been going on. So it's my job to share with you some of the things that I've discovered about how education functions, because for many people, when they realize what's actually going on, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance when they realize it's not what they thought was going on. Now, I'm particularly obsessed with the political radicalization of our education. So I'm going to stay on that theme today. And I'm going to bring to you one of my posts about a consultant that has been brought into one of the school boards here in Ontario, the Durham District School Board. This was, maybe November of 2024. And our school boards do hire a lot of outside consultants, and this is a consultant for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a massive deal at school boards in the province, and even the Ministry of Education has an entire equity secretariat that makes sure that they deliver all of these programs. So they spend an awful lot of money on these programs, but what are they? That's what we're going to explore today in this video. So thank you. Join me, grab a coffee, grab a tea, hell, if you want, grab a beer. I don't care. And let's watch this video together and unpick it. Okay, so here we are. This video was clipped from a Durham District School Board. I think it was a Black Excellence sort of meeting from that school board. And I unpicked this consultant who I thought was particularly interesting because I think she touches on a lot of interesting ideological points that I'd like to break down for you so that you understand what's being said in this talk and what's going on at that particular school board. So let's just watch this. I'll pause it every now and again and I'll give some supporting evidence around what she's saying.
Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Nicole Westburns. Dr. Nicole Westburns is an experienced professional development consultant whose work focuses on educational equity issues. For more than a decade, Dr. Westburns has had the pleasure of working in some capacity of professional learning with over 50% of the school boards in the province of Ontario. Her work focuses on empowering educators to create learning opportunities that are inclusive, affirming, and reflective of student identities. She also uses a thoughtful and evidence-based approach that encourages educators to reflect on their practices and make changes to better support all students. From 2013 to 2019, Dr. Westburns was a leader on equity initiatives and collaborations with the Ontario Ministry of Education. As a facilitator, she co-developed and co-led professional learning tied to CRRP for 39 school boards across the province. Over the past few years, Dr. Westburns has been leading professional learning with several school boards focused on anti-oppression and equity, including specific work focused on challenging anti-Black racism in education. Some of her clients have included Toronto District School Board, Peel District School Board, Halton District School Board, Brant Haldeman Norfolk Catholic District School Board, Ottawa Carleton District School Board, Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board, Upper Grand District School Board, and of course, our very own Durham District School Board. We would like to introduce and welcome Dr. Nicole Westburns to you all.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I don't believe that my camera is working, but I'm hoping you can hear me. I do have slides to share, so I would like to go ahead and do that if I might. My camera is working, so you can see me. Okay, great. I can't see myself. Well, we know how this is going to go. Thank you so much for letting me know. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. That's what I do. I turn my camera off. Well, hello, you can see my face, but I don't know that you can see me. Well, hello and welcome. Oh, now I see it. All right, thank you.
Let's just take a moment to note all of the things that are behind her. This is very activist looking already. We have a Black Lives Matter poster. We have an Every Child Matters poster. We have what appears to be some kind of pride posters here, anti-racism. So this is going to become important as we go along. But we're already getting vibes from Nicole here that she seems to have a bit of an interest in activism.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Avril, thank you for that introduction. And I'm just so pleased to be able to be here with you this evening for a little bit of time. Thank you to everyone who's been a part of this work as we've moved forward. So I do want to begin to share my slides. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and begin to share. I'm hoping that will work out. Yes, it looks like it will. Alrighty. So if I'm sharing my screen and then here, all right, well, it's a little bit messy, but here we go. All right, so everyone, thank you again for being here. Thank you to Director Williams-Taylor, Margaret Lazarus, Sean McCormick, the entire equity and anti-oppression team, and the many people that have been a part of this work that I've been privileged to be in partnership with within your board for the past several years. In roughly the next 10 minutes, I'm going to share with you this presentation, Building Educator Capacity in Addressing Anti-Black Racism, Exploring Possibilities with Critically Conscious Practitioner Inquiry, or what we've come to affectionately call CCPI. You know, in education, we love a good acronym. So I'm going to tell you about the origins of the CCPI work, how that connects into the work that we are doing to move things forward, to move the needle in terms of the experiences and outcomes for Black students. I'm going to tell you the why of it and what it seeks to do. I never claim that there's one way to move this needle. Multiple entries can do and should exist, but this is the way that I have contributed. And I have to laugh right here as we start. We had a few little glitches there, as you can see. Those things happen. I was told I have about 10 minutes to speak. I said to Margaret and Sean, y'all know I can't say nothing in 10 minutes, but I am going to try my best. And I'm going to actually reclaim my time and take back 30 seconds for the technical glitches. So here we go. So I start with a personal story, as I often bring into my work. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, some of you may know him, some of you may not. He was a scholar, a professor, a sociologist, a Pan-Africanist, an accomplished author, activist, first Black man to get a PhD from Harvard. And he was introduced to me in grade 5. You see, I had an...
In that description of W.E.B. Du Bois, she describes him in a lot of ways, but there's something very interesting that she's missing entirely out of that description. So I just want to take you on a little tour to have a look at something else. Who is W.E.B. Du Bois? Interestingly, the Ontario Principals Council, around the same time, this was just maybe a week later, put out this post that quoted W.E.B. Du Bois again. So, okay, he's an important figure. He's done all these things. Who is he? So this is another post I put out here. Education has become a socialist political project, and your children are the target. Pretty accurate. I still agree with this. W.E.B. Du Bois was an American socialist who linked race relations with communist ideologies throughout his life. Go search on the internet. It's all there. He represents the ideological origins of today's CRT training that ended up actually being the cause of the death of a beloved principal, Richard Bilkster, which is another story you should go look at. I also post about it quite a bit on my timeline. Du Bois was instrumental in linking the struggles of African Americans with broader socialist movements, notably through his work on Pan-African socialism and the critique of capitalism in works like Black Reconstruction. So she mentioned he was a Pan-African something. I don't remember what she referred to him as, but it's a socialist, it's a Marxist movement. His activities included promoting unionized labor, supporting the Russian Revolution, and collaborating with figures like George Padmore and Kwame, I'm sorry, I can't say this name, in an anti-colonial and socialist causes in Africa. And again, the Principals Council are promoting him, and so is this lady, but curiously leaving out the revolutionary roots of the work. So often, I'm just going to add this, often it's not what's being brought to the table is not, it can be an issue, like but the problem is that because they're Marxists, because they're socialists, because they're communists, basically they're interested in undermining the system, destroying, disrupting, and installing their own Marxist ideology. So that's what I wanted to point out. That's why it's not being mentioned. We're just glossing over all this history. We're just picking what we want to pick out of it. So let's go back to listening to Nicole.
Assignment for school. I often did my homework at the kitchen table where my mother might be in there washing my sister's baby bottles or preparing dinner for the evening. And we would talk about school and we would talk about what I was learning. So in grade 5, my teacher at my elementary school in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., with a total of 3 Black students, including myself and my brother, well, my teacher had given me a sheet of paper that day that was titled Famous Americans. And then there was a list of about 25 names on that page. And the instructions were to choose one and write a report. Now, I didn't recognize a lot of these names. And as usual, my mother and I would have conversations about what I was working on. So I said, Mom, I got this sheet of paper today. It says Famous Americans, and it lists 25 names. My mother said, Famous Americans. Now, you see, my mother went to all Black segregated schools, K to 12. She then went on to Howard University. And so she wanted to see who was on this sheet of Famous Americans. She said, give me that paper. I handed her the paper. She eyeballed it for a moment, and then she said, give me your pencil. I gave her my pencil. And then she proceeded to write on the tear-off portion at the bottom, Nicole will write her report about an African American. And I looked at her and I said, okay. I did not know who W.E.B. Du Bois was, but I knew that he was someone I should know. My mother told me to go into the den, look on the shelf, and get a book called The Souls of Black Folk. And from that point on, I did know who W.E.B. Du Bois was. I pulled from his work in grade 5 and again in my doctoral program, as he was a prolific thinker raising Black consciousness. And he had a lot to say about the education of Black children in public school systems, particularly at the point of school integration. In the mid-1900s in the United States, he warned us that, quote, we must not accept a proffered equality which is not equality, just because it does not include overt segregation. You see, W.E.B. Du Bois understood something that at that time many did not, or they disregarded, that the mere act of integration does not change the dominant culture being the group that has held power historically, politically, and socially, and thus controls our institutions like...
She's talking about hegemony, which is essentially a Marxist concept. The critical theorists talk about this. Antonio and Gramsci talk about hegemony. It's really popular in education. It's this idea that the dominant culture socially reproduces more of the dominant culture, and it's a socialist job to disrupt and dismantle the hegemony or the dominant culture for equality and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to argue whether this is true or not. I mean, there's some interesting ideas within it, but it's what they're using for at the end. And isn't it curious that she tells you a lot about W.E.B. Du Bois, and she has yet to mention that he's coming from a socialist Marxist, Black Marxist perspective, right? We're not going to mention that. We're going to talk about all the concepts around it. We're not going to mention the source.
Schools and how they operate. It does not change the dominant ideologies of the members of the dominant society who work in these schools. And so what does that mean for Black children's experiences in many of our modern day public school systems? Well, you all know the data. We're not going to talk about that tonight. And for far too many of us, it's not just the data we read in these reports. It's our lives. It's our children. It's maybe our grandchildren. It might have been our own experiences. What we know is that the conditions we face in these school systems, the outcomes we see, are often not reflective of what we deserve, of who we are, of our genius and excellence, as Director Williams Taylor talked about, of what our children's present and future potential is. So as I do this work in equity and anti-oppression education, addressing specifically anti-Black racism as well, I am always thinking about what can we do to really move this needle. I go back to the work of one of my sheroes, Dr. Ladson Billings, Gloria Ladson Billings, and she asked us to think about a very important question many, many years ago. She said, how are we positioning this? Because too often when we're looking at what's going on for Black students in schools, the gaze has been at the students. We've been looking at trying to fill a gap or close a gap or something like that, trying to fix something else. When she said this is about addressing what she called an educational debt which is owed to Black students for the ways in which we as education systems have failed them and have engaged in practices that have harmed and not taught them to their potential. The system owes them something different. The system owes them justice.
Gloria Ladson Billings. What an interesting person to bring up. One of Nicole's personal sheroes. What did Gloria Ladson-Billing write? She came up with something called culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, which is incredibly popular in education today. Even though teachers are supposed to have autonomy in the methods that they use, this method, which is Gloria Ladson-Billings, is highly promoted and encouraged under potentially even some strong arming in classrooms today. But what is culturally responsive, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy? Who is Gloria Ladson-Billings? Let's take a little look. I did another post on this. This is a leak that I was given. This is actually from schools. This is a Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario guide, pedagogy guide for teachers. So this is the kind of thing that would be left on the staff room table for teachers to flick through and so on and so forth to sort of advertise this particular pedagogy. And yeah, so I got my hands on this, which is fantastic. So let's have a little look at what they're advertising this to be. Okay, so this is the book here, as you can see. Oh. So it talks a lot about something called critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is a direct, is from Paulo Freire. And just before we move on, I'll just explain. Paulo Freire wrote this very, very, very important book in education, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In the very first page, it says, Paulo Freire was a revolutionary Brazilian educational theorist, heavily influenced by Hegel as well as a Marxist and anti-colonialist thinkers. Freire promoted the liberation of working classes through cooperative teacher-student education model. So he's another Marxist, and it's important to know that Paulo Freire has really strong ties to Toronto. We're kind of in the general Toronto area here. Let me just throw up this picture of Peter McLaren, who was part of the bringing of Paulo Freire to Canada through Toronto and through the I think it was the University of Toronto. Anyway, so there was a lot of academics at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and broader universities that popularized Paulo Freire. And here's a picture of Peter McLaren with it. Now, Peter McLaren is another Marxist. And Peter McLaren wrote such interesting, very prolific writer, Marxist pedagogue as well. And he wrote such titles as Che Guevara, Paulo Freire, and the Pedagogy of Revolution. He wrote Pedagogy of Insurrection. The Critical Pedagogy Manifesto, Teachers of the World Unite, and many, many other such titles. I made a video on Peter McLaren. It's kind of funny. He got mad in the comments that I didn't understand it, but whatever. So there's that up there. So there's a lot of links here. And so let's get back to critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is described by Paulo Freire as, I like the metaphor of the Easter that he uses. It's showing people how to die, like their hegemonic ideological soul or consciousness must die so that they can be reborn and view the world from the perspective of the oppressed. Okay, so it's a death of the ego, of the hegemonic ego, to be reborn on the side of the oppressed. That's what critical. So you get critical consciousness when you're reborn on the side of the oppressed. But how do you do that? How do you develop your critical consciousness, which is all essentially rooted in Marxist philosophy. So here, how do I incorporate opportunities to challenge the dominant culture and status quo? So this is a Marxist concept. How do I basically undermine society is what this is saying. The answer is, my classroom is a place where students develop understanding of social issues and learn to eradicate them. Let me point out, this is for K-12, so this would include very young children. And it says, in using local and global issues, students can understand the process to become advocates and allies. So we're creating activists. That bias should be challenged and questioned as part of learning. We know that so-called conservatives are being accused of book banning when they say they don't want sexualized books of children. And yet libraries, critically conscious libraries all over the place are getting rid of books en masse because they don't fit this ideological narrative of this ideology. So these are the biases we're talking about here. All learners have the ability to develop a discrimination-free mindset. Let me just point out, to discern, you have to discriminate. Discrimination isn't always a bad thing, because if we do not discriminate, we do not discern, we're open to all kinds of scams. We're open to all kinds of uncritical thinking. So not great. But what else does it say? So, what is critical consciousness? I am aware that the traditional classroom model is based and created to favor particular genders, identity groups, mindsets, and behaviors. I know the model of schooling in the North American context is associated with obedience. There does need to be a certain amount of discipline when we're dealing with groups of young children or any young children. That is important. I don't know about obedience, but there is a certain amount of conformity that's required with young children. There is a high probability that the culture, beliefs, and norms are informed by a dominant culture, again, that dominant culture, leaving schools to operate from a Eurocentric, Judeo-Christian, heteronormative lens. Quite ideological. Let's disrupt, dismantle the status quo because our Marxist ideology is telling us that that is oppression. We don't have evidence of this. Current child psychology tells us that children do actually need to have boundaries, understand the boundaries. They do need to, let's call it obedience. They do need to obey the rules, basically, to feel comfortable within those boundaries. But what they're saying is we need to undo that. This is all oppression. It's bad, okay? And they wonder why there's this discipline issues in school. But whatever. Let's go on. My student may be engaging in a change of behavior, mannerisms, or vernacular when they're in the classroom, better known as code switching, is a means to be in line with the dominant culture. This code switching, right, is like, well, if at home you might use a certain kind of slang and then you come to class and then you sort of adhere to the standard, that would be akin to wearing business attire when you go to a professional job. That's not code switching. That is behaving appropriate in certain settings. There's an appropriateness. I used to teach my son about this. You don't swear at work because it's inappropriate to do it at work. I don't really care that he did it at home because there weren't the same standards at home, right? That was just a personal family thing. But I taught him how to be appropriate in certain circumstances. They call that code switching. They don't want standards. They want to eliminate standards because standards are oppressive. They're white, what do they call it? Eurocentric, Judeo-Christian, heteronormative oppression. So I'll let you read this for yourself. There are enormous, like this little book here. I mean, if anyone wants, I can actually just take a picture of every single page so that people can read it and then post that. So that's what critical consciousness is. That's what Gloria Ladson-Billings is. It's heavily rooted in Marxist ideology, and it is very much about how to teach kids to be activists and how to disrupt and dismantle whatever they think is oppressive in society. It's a very, very destructive so-called pedagogy that's being highly, highly promoted in schools today on the basis that this is somehow going to help Black students.
And so Dr. Ladson-Billings went on in her work to look at what is going on within these school systems. What do schools need to do? What do teachers need to do? And in her seminal work in 1994, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings coined this phrase, culturally relevant pedagogy. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Well, this is what's at the root of it. And I always work with the educators to understand what is at the root. And so I share with you very quickly, Dr. Ladson-Billings looked at teachers who were successful with African-American children, and she theorized that and coded that, and she talked about what that meant. I will highlight for you just a few things. High expectations. What this meant was that we looked at all Black students and we know they are capable of learning, and expectations go along with that. In terms of cultural competence meant that these teachers were valuing who Black children are and where they come from, understanding that, as my mama would say, even if you didn't have two nickels to rub together, that has nothing to do with intellectually what you are capable of doing and being.
Cultural competence really means teaching students differently on the basis of their culture or their race. Like somehow Black students need to be taught in a different way than other students, which is quite racist, that you have to teach students differently on the basis of their race or culture. That's what cultural competence really means.
And critical consciousness, understanding how issues of oppression play out in our world and actually teaching us about that and pushing back to it. Now,
notice how she still hasn't pointed out, because she went on about how this is rooted, what it's rooted in, and she's describing all these things. She has yet not mentioned any of the socialist or Marxist roots of any of the things that she's saying.
Since 1994, when this work came out, still highly acclaimed, still very relevant today, still at the foundations of what I would say any solid piece of academic work that comes out tied to Black students and their schooling experiences. Even so, the research tells us that the critical consciousness is the least likely component that teachers will take up. And so what we know is that that critical consciousness is that understanding of oppression, how oppression has historically taken place and how it's taking place today, being able to push back to it. It originally comes from Paulo Freire's work in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, when he talked about education for freedom, education for liberation. And so what I came to know as I was doing this work many years ago is that we cannot help teachers to do this work with students if they have not done some of this work for themselves. Dr.
Still no mention of the Marxism. Let me just take you on another little tour. I'm going to go show you another little video that I posted a little while ago. This is actually from a training, a lady called Karen Devonish Mazota. It was a training for the Ontario Teachers Federation, and I think they operate in Toronto. I don't know if they operate wider than Toronto. But anyway, so this is a teachers union. Union is very important. W.E.B. Du Bois said so. We know that unions come from socialist organizing. Anyway, they're super, super important, and they're pushing this critical consciousness. But what are we being told about critical consciousness in this particular training from last year, I believe it was?
Since you use the words of Paulo Freire, as you would see on the slide, when speaking about the influence that schools can have on society in general, if teachers allow students to question the norms, the morals, the values that produce inequalities in our society. Schools can and should serve as places of destabilization, of disruption. We need to push back the status quo. I mean, imagine the possibilities in society if that actually happened in our classrooms. I have to say, an experience I had today, and I was telling Kalpana about it, we invited Civics Canada through Rep Day to have an MP speak up close and possible with our students, our local MP. And today, watching the students feel confident enough to ask questions about, what is the federal government doing about issues of housing for new Canadians here in our riding, like to hear them ask that question, and it really was spontaneous, was just so much of, to me, a reification of critical consciousness coming out of the mouths of a grade 5 and putting them in the position to be able to speak to somebody who has the ear of the Prime Minister is so important, to give the kids the chance to realize their critical consciousness and really validate their thinking, knowing that their thoughts will speak truth to power.
Okay, let's be clear. She's talking about teachers using critical consciousness. We know critical consciousness is a far left Marxist ideology applied to education to create activists for far left causes. She's talking about grade 5 students. These are young kids. Basically getting young kids to learn how to be social justice activists, and she's proud of that. There's a lot inappropriate in this. Like, I don't have a problem with helping young people advocate for themselves, but this is a very, very unique, it's only far left direction, it's only Marxist orientated, it's only in the social justice, that's the only acceptable thing. They're not going to allow students to advocate for, let's say, so-called far right, right? That would be terrible, but far left causes are encouraged. So a grade 5 class using critical consciousness to get them to learn how to be far left, Marxist orientated social justice activists. Now, I just want to play another one from this particular training here.
Finally, Lance and Billing observed that teachers in her study consistently demonstrated why critical consciousness is and was so necessary for schools. Students and teachers developed critical consciousness through challenging the status quo of the current social order. Critical consciousness highlights systems of oppression, injustice, inequity, and it should transform thought and moves to action to intentionally dismantle and eradicate sources of injustices. Critical consciousness is the aspect of CRP that I observe in going to different schools, seeing my teacher candidates, that teachers do the least of with regard to culturally relevant pedagogy. And it's really too bad, because that's the most important aspect. And so much of critical consciousness drives and impacts academic success and cultural competence.
So these two ladies have said that teachers are the most reluctant to use critical consciousness, and that might be because those teachers actually have a moral compass and they understand that this is inappropriate to be teaching, to using your role of authority to be indoctrinating, because that's what it is, indoctrinating young students, because they don't care if you're in kindergarten. They're going to teach oppression to very, very young children to get them to become what they want. This is an indoctrination process. Critical consciousness is an indoctrination process. So those teachers not doing it, well done. I support that. But there is a distinct push right now to advertise and to promote critical consciousness and culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy in the classroom, certainly here in Ontario. Very, very pronounced, and I see it all the time.
Ladson Billings reminds us that we've got to work on our pedagogical and worldview shifts. The process of developing a worldview that differs from dominant worldview requires active intellectual work on the part of the knower, because school, society, and the structure and production of knowledge are designed to create individuals who internalize dominant worldview and knowledge production and the acquisition process. So she goes on in Disrupting Whiteness in Teacher Education to ask this question: how do white, middle class, prospective teachers, right? You're talking about teacher candidates. We could say teachers in classrooms today make the transition from being unaware of their culture to a critical understanding of the role of culture, power, and oppression. That is a part of what CCPI work seeks to do.
There's a lot of hateful rhetoric in what we just heard. What the hell is whiteness? I mean, I won't go into it, but whiteness to a Marxist is just another form of capitalism, and it's because they're Marxist. Basically, being whiteness is a form of cultural capital, and because it's capital and they're anti-capitalists, they want to disrupt and dismantle whiteness because it's a privilege. It's a whole thing if you go out into the theory, but they don't tell you they're Marxist on purpose so that you buy all of this rubbish that they're selling you.
And so as we engage in this work, we create a parallel pathway. Now, inquiry has been a part of work in Ontario for teachers for many, many years. But I think this was a new way of thinking about inquiry, because it requires not that we just do some kind of inquiry, but that we're also inquiring into ourselves. In that parallel pathway, educators are being provided with information to build their own critical consciousness while engaging in action in an inquiry to address how anti-Black racism has and is playing out, and what their sphere of control and influence might be, how they might change it. My partner in good trouble, Karen Murray from the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement.
Sorry to keep pausing. She said, partner in good trouble. You are going to hear this all the time if you start studying education. What is good trouble? It is a reiteration or a rebranding of something called beautiful trouble. And I did have to pause this yet again. What is beautiful trouble? What is beautiful trouble? Beautiful trouble is another socialist slash Marxist slash social justice activist slash far left radical Antifa organizing tool. And the unions are really, really keen on using it. You hear it all the time being mentioned: beautiful trouble, good trouble. This is what they mean. Good trouble is a set of activist strategies and tools. Activist, it's very Antifa-like. It's basically how to get what you want for the far left. Let's go have a little look here, some tactics. It'll give you like a whole bunch of things that you can do: blockades, banner hangs, civil disobedience, clandestine leafing, creative disruption, divestment. A lot of this is based on Saul Alinsky's 12 Rules for Radicals, but not all. Hashtag campaigns, guerrilla projection. Let's see if we can go into one. Hunger strike. Jail solidarity. I haven't looked through all of these in a while. Nonviolent search and seizure. Yeah, it's just tactics for far left activists. Basically, it's an ideological tool. So it's no coincidence that that's being mentioned, that she has a partner in good trouble, which is this. That's what it is. So what is her partner in good trouble doing?
And a system superintendent in Toronto District School Board and I have worked together for a long time. And we came up with these questions many years ago to help us frame this work. Questions that at the core we must be asking as we are working with educators. How might we make sure we understand the context ourselves and the actions. In terms of context, we build knowledge around common vocabulary with the teachers. We are talking about what is anti-Black racism in Canada historically and present day, and what does that mean in education? We talk about the ways that white supremacy has impacted us and the characteristics of that in our dominant institutions that play out in everything that happens.
White supremacy is the system that allows whiteness. White supremacy is capitalism. They want to destroy capitalism. That's what she's actually saying. They're not honest about it because they're doing beautiful trouble.
We've built our knowledge around the individual, ideological, and systemic practices. And we have not started from this place of, well, is it here? We go to Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who says, if you live in a society with smog, you cannot help but breathe it in. We reflect on the smog. And so one of the things we know if we look at the teacher iceberg is that there are important pieces that surface. The curriculum is important, the behaviors are important, classroom environment important. But what we know is that what's really important is what is below the waterline. That's what matters. That's what plays out also, whether we see it or don't see it. The ideologies, the biases, the beliefs, and the purpose, all of that of the educator are important for us to work on.
And yet she has yet to identify the ideologies that are underpinning this entire curriculum that she's proposing. Her entire consultancy is based on. She has yet to mention the ideologies, the biases, and the beliefs and purposes that are underpinning basically the under the waterline of herself. That's a lot of projection. The iron law of woke projection never misses.
As well. So all of this must be and is a part of the CCPI work. Now, in this work, I like to say I take folks back to school. We do readings. We have pre-readings with every session. We have readings as follow-up, and we have readings additionally along the way. We are building our knowledge about history and content and things that maybe as educators, they've never had an opportunity to learn about. There's follow-up journal reflections. We are writing. We are engaging in something called race reflective journaling, which has been shown.
Race reflective journaling is a way to develop race consciousness, which is a form of critical consciousness. And it's about how to see the world through the lens of race. It's a form of how to radicalize yourself on the question of race. There's lots of different ways of radicalizing yourself for this basically radical Marxist ideology. It could be race, it could be sex, it could be gender, it could be a lot of things. Gender is a really popular one at the minute, but it's about making yourself race conscious to see the world through the lens of race, to radicalize yourself so that you become a social justice advocate and in yourself become a teacher, activist, and engage in good trouble and radicalize students in school.
To actually make a difference in terms of this work, helping us to unpack things, record moments of tension, record moments of aha and learnings. They're key parts in this work, and they're a part of the CCPI process. And so this is what the process looks like in the red there. Educator chooses something they want to know more about and creates a question. That happens several sessions in because, again, we're making sure that we're all singing from the same song sheet, that we all come with some critical understandings about what it is that we are addressing. We're not going to try to put Band-Aids on things. We're going to get to the root and get to the surface. So we try to really think about what is at play. The educator creates the questions or the teams. They create action plans. All of their questions and action plans, I'm able to vet. We have conferences. We talk about them. They're supported by the many wonderful people in the Equity Anti-Oppression and other folks who've pulled together to do this work in your board. And then they're in the Nike phase. I call it just do it. They're doing it, doing it, doing it. They're learning from what they're doing. They're still engaged in readings and professional learning communities. And then they're looking at, what did we learn? What do we need to do next? How do we need to learn more about this? How can we go further? Most of the work I pull from is from the thinking of Black scholars, brilliant Black folks who come with that sociopolitical consciousness, things that are rooted in understanding.
The closest she comes in this entire thing to name the ideology and biases and all that stuff that she is completely advertising and promoting. What did she say? Let's just listen to that again. The sociopolitical
work I pull from is from the thinking of Black scholars, brilliant Black folks who come with that sociopolitical
consciousness. But she still doesn't say what that sociopolitical consciousness is. This is no mistake, guys. I see this all the time. They will spew all of this Marxist rubbish that if you understand what they're saying, you can unpick it, but they never actually call out what it is.
things that are rooted in understanding Black genius and excellence. This is one of the texts or two of the texts that we pull from one of the authors, Dr. Goldie Muhammad, as we look at curriculum. We emphasize curriculum in this work often because curriculum is a place where teachers have a great sphere of control and influence. And so Dr. Muhammad's framework talks about holistic development. We want to think about who our children are in all their ways of being. So we focus in on identity as a component and making sure they have the requisite skills to make any kind of decisions they want to make in the future. We help to build their intellect around things that are important in the world, important for them to know, help them understand criticality, understanding these inequities, and how, again, that is not a barrier and that cannot hold them back, helping them to build up what Cornel West called a cultural armor about who they are and what they can do. And last but not least,
this is the radicalization training. This is how you get radicalized.
Been mentioned a few times here, joy. Joy is absolutely essential when we think about the experiences for Black children, Indigenous children. Historically in our schools, joy has not been there. So these are the 5 components from which teachers are beginning to build curriculum or continuing to build curriculum tied into much of the CCPI work. What I will just share with you as I wrap up is that this work has been something that I think has had some impact in terms of the thinking of the educators. There were surveys done. There's surveys done at the end of each cohort, and maybe some of these have been shared with you all previously.
There were surveys done. There's 53 responses. 53 responses of just super basic surveys. And I love how they present it like this is really important data that you need to look at. Look how great we're doing from these surveys. Anyway, I'm going to stop it here because she's just talking about the survey. But remember, this is a Durham District School Board. It is a consultant that was hired by the Durham District School Board, spewing just Marxist stuff about how they're going to radicalize how they're working on radicalizing teachers within the board, who obviously are a little bit reluctant to do the critical consciousness for whatever reason. I don't actually have an answer to why there's a resistance to that, although I'm happy to hear there's a resistance. But they're getting paid the big bucks to essentially make an attempt to radicalize the teacher pool. And that'll be supported by the unions quite heavily with materials like this one, for example, that they'll be passing around. And they'll be doing a lot of training. That is essentially the end of my video. I hope that you learned a little bit about the terminology in this video. I'm going to be putting out more videos based on some of the tweets that I put up because, as I said, I understand that some people don't have Twitter, but a lot of my best stuff has actually been posted up on there. So I'm going to go back through the backlog and share some of that stuff with you because this is going to certainly the culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy is going to come up more and more. There is some stuff on my Twitter that I haven't, or X, whatever, that I haven't mentioned here about CRRP. But if you search my profile for CRRP, or culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, there's some other stuff on there. But yeah, so this is going to become increasingly popular. That's my prediction. So I hope that was useful to you, and I will see you next week.